Get ready to take a flamethrower to the official narrative and learn what the elites don't want you to know. You're listening to The Tom Woods Show.
Hey everybody, Tom Woods here. It's episode 2616 of The Tom Woods Show. Dan McCarthy back with us, editor of Modern Age, vice president of the Collegiate Network at the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, syndicated columnist. I read his columns in the New York Post on a regular basis. And I thought we'd talk about in effect, the Trump agenda, but also, I suppose, really, we're talking about the State of the Union address, but what it portends for the next 4 years. So, Dan, welcome back.
Thank you, Tom.
All right. I don't think I watched any of Trump's addresses, maybe the first one. So were they all so contentious with people shouting? And in fact, one member had to actually be removed from the chamber. What's going on? Is that common?
No, this was absolutely unprecedented. So, there's been this big question about how Democrats are going to respond to the fact that Donald Trump won the popular vote this time, that he he's holding all the cards. The whole resistance ideology they had back in 2017 no longer makes sense when you have such a clean win as President Trump had. He won all 7 battleground states. And as he was going over that litany and reciting all of these victories, that's when the Democrats exploded, and one of them had to be removed from the chamber because he just would not follow the rules. So that was, as President Trump said just a few days ago, that was some remarkable television.
And it's interesting that he didn't really respond to it. And you would think somebody of Trump's temperament that he, might have made he did make a couple of funny comments here and there, but he really didn't acknowledge the disorder in the room. He just let it take its course, and he just spoke louder.
Well, he, I think, is confident enough in his position now, and with the vice president to one side of him, Speaker Johnson on the other side, and Johnson, prepared to enforce the rules of the chamber. Trump did exactly the right thing. I mean, if he had tried to shout over his hecklers, he would have been reduced to their level. Instead, this is a time for the person who, has the room to just step aside and let the people who are responsible for enforcement do their job. I mean, it's like, if you're the owner of the mall, let the mall cops do the enforcing for you. You shouldn't be getting involved with, the teenagers who are acting in a rowdy fashion yourself.
They were, of course, there was one member who had to be escorted out, and there were others who were shouting various things. And my wife was saying if it had been the reverse, I don't think Republicans would have been shouting things at Kamala. I mean, they might have booed, they might not have applauded at the appropriate moment, but this was, I thought it came off looking bad for them. I mean, yes, it looks good to that chunk of the electorate that is, psychotically against Trump, but I think to the average person, it just looks like sour grapes.
Oh, totally. And again, I mean, the Democrats really exploded right when Trump was talking about the election results, which suggests that, they're not just mad at Trump, they're mad at the American voters for having elected him. I was, not only, certainly that aspect of the night, really early on, seeing the Democrats completely lose their temper. I mean, it's like they all thought they were Vladimir Zelensky, right? They were all going to suddenly, have their little incident in the White House. That was humiliating for them. That really, I thought, even, obviously I'm not sympathetic to the Democrats, but even just in the most cold-blooded analytical sense possible, looking at that was, I think, a self-inflicted humiliation for the Democrats that they could have avoided that. They could have just sat there in silence. They could have, been stony-faced. They could have done any number of things, but instead they seemed like college protesters, basically. They seemed like they were representative of the very silliest and least tolerant and most immature elements of their own base. And so, I think you saw, the real Democratic Party there. The Democrats, they would like to present themselves as being the party now of maturity, and they would like to say that Donald Trump, he's too much off the cuff, he's too rough, he's too, impolite, he's too, against the norms of Washington, D.C. But obviously, every single norm in Washington, D.C. was against what the Democrats did tonight. So they cannot, hold themselves up as being the party of norms and the party of civility. They are a party of barbarism. And, however controversial Trump's policies might be, what the Democrats did tonight, I think, completely removes any standing that they had.
It seemed to me that Trump, I mean, yes, it's true that he put forth his own ideas, and particularly with regard to the economy and how he might use tariffs as a way to bring about desired outcomes. But he was also spending some time trying to make sure that a couple of albatrosses remained around the necks of the Democrats. And one of them was the transgender issue. And I think the mainstream of America, even though they've been terrorized into silence on the question, is just not with the Democrats on that. Just ordinary people, they know there's something screwy about this. And then secondly, the matter of illegal aliens coming over the border, people of extreme disrepute, let's say, coming over the border and committing horrific crimes. There's no denying that happened. And he highlighted that in, his opponents will call it a manipulative and exploitative way, but his allies will say he took that issue and squarely placed it in the lap of the Democrats, that they are responsible for this, and let them sit there and sulk instead of standing and cheering for the cause of, frankly, law and order.
I had exactly the same impression. And, you always have these guests who have, stories that are either sort of heart-wrenching or kind of, affirming, perhaps on the other side. But you always have these stories that are brought into the State of the Union. And normally they seem like they are shoehorned in. And, when there is a political angle to them, as there always is, the political angle usually seems like it's just kind of pandering to a specific group. You'll see union employees, for example, at a Democratic State of the Union. This time, Donald Trump basically took the raw materials of that kind of formality of having guests who have politically relevant stories, and he transformed it into something that actually seemed organic, or if organic is not quite the right word, certainly that was effective in a whole, sort of in a way that was just head and shoulders above anything we have seen before in that kind of format. So yes, every time he would, bring up a tough policy, whether it's, stronger policing, whether it's safety for children, especially, in keeping them away from the transgender ideology, whether it was, border safety, border control, all these things, he had people who were the absolute, sort of personifications of why this is a problem for America, why this has to be dealt with. And they were just very, very sympathetic people. So it humanized these issues, which otherwise might seem abstract. They might seem like just controversies that people have, opposing feelings about. But here were actual human beings who had suffered the consequences for these policies and for these controversies. And, I think Trump painted the Democrats into a corner on all of those issues, on transgenderism, on the border, on crime, and then I thought it was also quite, remarkable. Again, you always have some positive stories, some feel-good, guests. In this case, after Trump made very, very, sort of tough remarks, constantly blaming the Democrats basically for everything bad that's happened in the last 4 years, and a lot of that with good reason. He then, and he pointed out very early in the speech too, the Democrats, even when he talked about something, the best possible outcome that might have been achieved under him, no Democrat could afford to stand up or applaud or smile or laugh or show any sense of goodwill. So I thought that was quite important too, that Trump pointed out the theatricality of the whole, evening. But then he was able to actually find a few things which, without being totally just banal, actually did put the Democrats in a position where they would have to clap. So, for example, there was the 13-year-old who was suffering from a brain tumor and who was, very pro-law enforcement, who wanted to be a police officer himself. And, Donald Trump brought out the head of the Secret Service and deputized this young man right there in the halls of Congress. So, and of course, this was a young African-American boy. So, what Democrat is going to be able to sit there and, pull ugly faces while this, young African-American boy who has a brain tumor is being given, the chance of a lifetime to, be honored as a Secret Service agent, or the young man who was applying to West Point and who was, admitted to West Point on the spot by the president during his remarks. I worry about the precedent of all of this stuff in some ways, because I thought Trump did it very well I generally like what Trump is doing, so obviously, this all fits together. But he has innovated something, or at least has improved something that already existed, that is now so powerful that, you really do worry about what other people are going to do with this in the future, and might be able to use it to, get through all kinds of crazy things by having a victim or someone who, has whose life dreams depend on the president, whatever party that might be from. In the future, they may be able to use that in a very abusive way.
Folks, a lot of us feel pressed for time every day. Sometimes when you're pressed for time, you make bad eating choices. Well, Factor has chef-made gourmet meals that make eating well easy. They're ready to heat and eat in just a few minutes, so you can feel right and feel great no matter what life throws at you. Factor meals are what I eat for lunch pretty much every day. They arrive fresh and fully prepared, and with 40 options across 8 dietary preferences on the menu each week, it's easy to pick meals tailored to your goals. Choose from preferences like Calorie Smart, Protein Plus, or Keto. And it's not just lunch, by the way, which is when I enjoy my own Factor meals. Factor can help you feel your best all day long with wholesome smoothies, breakfasts, grab-and-go snacks, and more add-ons. Reach your goals this year with ingredients you can trust and convenience that can't be beat, so you won't be tempted to make the wrong choices. Eat smart with Factor. Get started at factormeals.com/woods50off and use code WOODS50off to get 50% off your first box plus free shipping. That's code WOODS50off at factormeals.com/woods50off to get 50% off plus free shipping on your first box. Well, I don't disagree with that. He did say, he acknowledged the situation, at least indirectly. He said something like, no matter what I do or say, none of these people you see here, meaning the Democrats, will laugh, smile, applaud, or stand. That's just absolutely nothing I do. I could announce a cure for a terrible disease. And he went on and on. There's nothing that I can do. And what they did do while they sat there, apart from being disruptive and rude, was they held little signs, some of them, and they were save Medicaid or something idiotic like that, or one side said false, because these are the people we rely on to tell us the truth. And then I put on Twitter, just a few days ago, there was an article about, I think it was in USA Today, I'm not sure where it was, but it was why Democratic women will be wearing pink and white. And I didn't even click on it. I took a screenshot of the headline, I put it on Twitter, and I said, who the blankety blank cares? I mean, I don't even get, who knows what it is, but I can guarantee you, whatever it is irrelevant, idiotic, moronic, a waste of time. So I never found out, Dan, and if you know, I don't even want to know.
No, I'm in the same boat. I saw the headline and thought, well, that's the kind of thing I expect from them. So I just don't care why they're doing it. Because I know it's all just performance. The Democrats have only themselves to blame for having adopted a number of policies that are not just unpopular, they're not just mistaken, they're actually insane. And they're actually, just revolting to ordinary Americans, whether it's the open borders that let criminals come into our country and kill American young women, whether it's, transgenderism. And, one of the shocking stories that was presented tonight was that you had, by the way, I don't know when viewers are watching this, but Tom and I have just seen this not quite State of the Union address. But in any case, one of these, the mother of a young woman who, was basically subjected to trans ideology, and, the school wasn't even telling her mother what they were doing to her, and they changed her pronouns, they changed her name. What normal person of any, look, I don't care if you're a communist, I don't care if you are the most left-wing person on the planet. How can anyone just justify this as normal or healthy and not a form of child abuse? So, and Trump, I don't think he sensationalized any of this. He, stated it plainly. He said, now, according to, the executive branch of the federal government, there are 2 genders, there's male and female. We do not let men into women's spaces. We do not have men playing in women's sports and, inflicting permanent injuries on women who, can't be as physically robust as a man in, pretending to be a woman. All of that was just common sense. And I have to say, when I first saw that President Trump in his inauguration and afterward has been using this theme of common sense, I thought, well, that sounds utterly banal. That's just not something that, really goes anywhere. But it actually does this time because it's connected to things that really are common sense that the Democrats have completely abandoned in going insane. I mean, one thing that's really striking, both with the Democrats' behavior tonight and also where they've painted themselves into a corner ideologically, is that they really are the party of the campus left. That's how they behave when they are listening to the president speak at the State of the Union, or not quite State of the Union. And it's also where their ideology is coming from. I mean, they're the ideology of the radical decolonization people, the radical transgender people, all that straight out of the college campus. It has no bearing, in real life. And now that President Trump has said it's okay for corporations and the military and government to get rid of all this DEI nonsense and to get rid of this transgender ideology, everyone is breathing a sigh of relief. So I think the Democrats are in a very tough position, which is perhaps why they're acting out in just such a, sort of wildly thrashing manner.
Shortly before we recorded this, you had to write something for the New York Times. What was it that you wrote? What were you asked to write?
Well, as it happens, I was thinking just a moment ago as we were having this conversation, we're going over the very things that I wrote about. So the New York Times will do a survey of people who occasionally write opinion pieces for them. And they do want to have a couple of pro-Trump or Republican voices in these surveys. So you're asked to give a score between 0 and 10 about, first of all, the content of the speech, second, the style of the speech, how well it was delivered, and then also to, write a few comments about the best part of the night, the worst part of the night, and something else that, sort of attracted your attention. And basically, the best, the worst, and something else that drew my attention, we've covered all of that in the things we've discussed right now, not because I brought them up, but because you did. So clearly, we're either completely on the same wavelength, or just an ordinary person watching, tonight's event would have had the same conclusions of the best, the worst, and the other notable things. So I said the best was, I said the worst was the Democrats, losing their cool right at the beginning. I said the other very notable thing about it was Trump's effectiveness at integrating these stories into what's, otherwise a controversial, set of political positions, which are now common sense because of the way he's integrated these stories into them. And then I said, actually, one of the best things of the night was simply Trump at the very beginning calling out the Democrats and saying, I could cure cancer and they would still not stand up and applaud for me. So, which I thought was a great way of just exposing how just, what a formality and what a sort of performance, the Democrats' response to tonight was going to be.
I always wondered how they, I mean, I think you're like the best possible representative of the, let's say, the Trump way of thinking to be writing in the New York Times, because you on election night or going into the day after the election, you gave it to them good and hard. That basically you all had this coming. It is richly deserved, and yet you still maintain a kind of academic. See, veneer is the wrong word, because that sounds like superficiality. But you sound like an academic while you are thrashing them over the head. So I'm always pleased to hear every time you have something to write in the New York Times. I think, the world is getting slightly better.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
So let's say a little something about Ukraine, because we're dealing with a chamber that not very long ago was waving a foreign flag, inside there. And now Trump is, Trump. And he's decided that this is not going to go on. And if he has anything to say about it, and it's like the Democrats have just absolutely hitched their wagon to this thing, come what may. What did you think about how that was handled?
Yeah, so you certainly did see, at least I did during some of the camera pans that I saw looking at the audience, there were people actually dressed in the colors of the Ukrainian flag. So some of those may have been Democrats, some of them may have been guests, but in any case, there were people certainly, standing up for Ukraine, and just in terms of, having the colors on their very bodies. When Trump started talking about Russia and Ukraine, there were a few things that he said which immediately got applause. And it seemed to me that maybe this was an occasion where there were applause coming both from the Democrats and from the Republicans, because, the way Trump was phrasing things, at first it sounded like he was kind of in favor of maybe the same kind of blank checks for Ukraine that, that Zelensky had previously been getting. But that wasn't the case. And, a few words later, it was very clear that Trump was actually saying, no, this kind of blank check has to stop. The Europeans have to take primary responsibility for what happens in their own neighborhood. And a peace deal needs to be struck very, very soon. And one of the things that really impresses me in terms of Trump's courage is he always, especially in tonight's remarks, said, he is, just appalled at the amount of death of Ukrainians that's happening. But he also said, the Russian conscripts who are having to fight for Russia, for Vladimir Putin, he also, laments their deaths. And that's, I don't know how much, in Florida where you live or other parts of the country, people hear this, but in Washington, D.C., the people who are most enthusiastic for the Ukraine war often seem like they're less pro-Ukraine than they are simply genocidally inclined towards the Russians. They think Russians are inherently evil, and any Russian that dies is a good thing, a thing to be celebrated. And they'll usually try to talk about Putin if they can, but once they start slipping and revealing what they really believe, they'll say, well, you know what? We should just keep the war going as long as possible. It doesn't matter how many Ukrainians die in it. What matters is how many Russians die. That's the measure of whether something's good or not. And Trump does not accept that. And I recall even during Trump's first administration, there was a time when his advisors, maybe John Bolton or one of the others, gave him a plan for bombing Iran, bombing out an Iranian base. And Trump looked at it and he said, well, what are the casualties going to be? And they said, Mr. President, there aren't going to be any civilian casualties. It's just a military base. It'll just kill some soldiers. And Trump said, no, I want to know what the casualties for the soldiers will be. And they told him, and he said, well, that's too much. This is just out of proportion. This is not the right thing to do. So I think Trump is, there are plenty of criticisms that, people from all over the political spectrum can make of him. I think this guy really does care about human life, in terms of war, in a way that no other leader we've seen in, generations has cared about.
Well, Dan, this will be the third time out of 3 episodes this week that I've talked about Ukraine, but more specifically what happened, in the White House with Trump, Vance, and Zelensky. But I said the other day that what was most striking about that to me was not so much the drama and the theater of it, as it was the realization that in real time I am witnessing the making of American foreign policy in defiance of the existing foreign policy establishment. And that, I don't remember in my lifetime when the last time was that happened.
I agree. And I do worry that President Trump was correct at the end of that episode where he said that, Zelensky is just not interested in peace. And, Zelensky has now written a letter to the president saying that he is ready for peace. He is ready to have these negotiations. He is ready to sign the, minerals deal with the United States. But Zelensky, in his temper and in his, the way he responded, in person, live, right there in front of the cameras with J.D. Vance and Secretary Rubio and President Trump all in the room, certainly indicated that this guy, doesn't really want to have a deal, doesn't really want to see peace. I worry, if you have this minerals deal, for example, and you have American business interests or others getting involved in, trying to help rebuild while also getting, paid back for the money that America is pouring into Ukraine. But if I'm not saying the Ukrainians would deliberately harm Americans there, but if someone like Zelensky were, given a choice of, hey, do you warn the Americans that there's a minefield here that the Russians put down, or do you let something bad happen so that, you can blame it on the Russians? I shudder to think, what would happen. And I say this, I should point out, because people watching this are going to say, oh, that's terrible. How can you possibly say bad things about Ukraine? That means you're pro-Putin. That means you're pro-Russian. No, the Russians invaded Ukraine. The Russians are, doing the worst things here. But just as a matter of reality, any country, a smaller country like Ukraine being invaded by a much larger one like Russia, and a very brutal one like Russia, is going to use whatever leverage it can possibly get under any circumstances in order to strengthen its case, in order to pull America, a stronger country, into fighting its battle. And so I really do worry that, as long as Zelensky is around, you may very well have some perverse incentives here for Ukraine not to be a good faith partner. And I do hope that, if Zelensky were to go, whether he was replaced by a general or whether, a democratic election would find a leader who has popular, support and who perhaps represents in part, because there really is a peace party in Ukraine. Not everyone wants to be conscripted to die in a war that they're not winning. But certainly I think Ukraine as a nation needs good faith leadership. And I'm just not sure, based on Zelensky's response a week ago, that he is a leader acting in good faith at this point.
Hey everybody, let's take a minute to thank our sponsor, Persist SEO. If you're getting buried by your competition online, then build your brand, your reputation, and your lead flow with digital marketing by Persist SEO. If you're a small local business trying to compete against large companies in the service industry, then increase your visibility with Persist SEO. What if you have low or no leads coming in on a consistent basis? Well, then website search engine and conversion optimization can help move the needle to a more prosperous business model for you. Are you tired of cold calling and networking? Use your website as a lead generation engine. What if you're not showing up for your services in the search engines? Well, get found with Persist SEO Expert Search Engine Optimization. All you have to do is call 770-580-3736 or visit them at ineedseo.help for a free website audit and consultation. That's 770-580-3736 or ineedseo.help. There seems to be an awful lot of overlap between being, let's say, unreasonably anti-Russia to the point of being unwilling even to talk. I mean, remember, American presidents spoke to far worse individuals than Putin. Believe it or not, there have been worse individuals than this guy. There have. And the United States has talked to them and negotiated with them. But all the same, there seems to be quite a bit of overlap between unreasonably anti-Russian people in let's say, right of center and never Trumpers. And I can't imagine that's just fortuitous. Like, what's the connection there? What does that mean?
Well, I think that you and I were right 20 years ago and more when we diagnosed where the neocons are really coming from. They love war. And, it's kind of sad to say it as bluntly as that, but they have this belief that war is a messianic force. And they subscribe to mythology, which is odd because, they're not completely stupid and they know this mythology is false, but they subscribe to a mythology, a kind of, a set of religious almost beliefs about, supposedly how World War II purified the world rather, that it showed that appeasement never works, even though, of course, World War II actually ended with appeasement. It ended with the United States and the West appeasing Joseph Stalin, giving him, Poland and Eastern Europe. Even though what got, Britain and France into the war in the first place in 1939 was the joint Nazi and Soviet dismemberment of Poland. World War II is not a, salvific episode in in world history. It is instead, a war perhaps that was necessary, a war that, had some positive outcomes, but a war that also involved tremendous evil and, did not have a clear, happily ever after ending. Far from it. I mean, it really was a horror from the beginning to the end. So, there is this mythology, however, that war is this wonderful, purifying force, and that, that evil is a material thing, and material things can be destroyed by bombs. So all that's necessary is to kill the few materially evil people, whether that's an individual like Putin, maybe it's an entire nation like the Russians. Maybe Russia just has to be dismembered and carved up into, smaller states that can be, kept from causing any trouble. But you have these, kind of ludicrous view of human nature, which says that bombs can purify it, bombs can improve it, as opposed to bombs being, maybe you have to use them to defend yourself, but you're not making the human race better by, creating nuclear weapons and by, blowing up foreign countries, killing civilians that happen to be in enemy countries. But all of that is evil. And it may, again, I'm not naive here. There are evils that may be necessary, in the way the world is right now. But to celebrate these things as good, positive goods, that's I think very wicked, and yet that's where a lot of these folks are coming from. And I've been very shocked that, I've been quite critical of Zelensky recently. Everyone who defends Zelensky, they never say to me, Dan, the U.S. should continue to give Zelensky a blank check because we are close to winning this war, or even if we're not close to winning it, we have a plan that in the next year or two, if we keep getting this much support, we're going to have tremendously different results than we've seen in the last 3 years. And therefore, it would be a mistake to withdraw this support right now. I never get that. Instead, what I get is always just, well, how can you possibly not recognize that Putin is evil? the not just the morality, but the whole logic, if you can even call it that, of this position seems to be something is evil, therefore we should just spend money and kill people. And even if there is no rational connection between the spending the money and the killing people and the reduction of that evil, we should still just keep doing this anyway until, by doing the same thing over and over again, somehow that evil just miraculously disappears. And of course, this was exactly the argument with Afghanistan. We spent 20 years occupying Afghanistan, rebuilding Afghanistan, fighting in Afghanistan, dying in Afghanistan. And at the end of the 20 years, it turns out, well, guess what? We not only didn't stop the evil Taliban, but they came back as powerful as ever as soon as we left. Now, we're going to try this again, but we're going to do it with Russia, which has nuclear weapons and which, is capable of really starting World War III. It would seem to me that what didn't work in Afghanistan isn't working in Ukraine, and peace is an imperative right now. Again, it's not, and people say, well, you're saying that Ukraine should give up everything. No, not at all. Look, the Russians have failed to take more than, they got Crimea in 2014. The Donbass has been destabilized for a long time. The Russians, however, have not made very impressive gains. And, they've been checked already. The Europeans are taking their defense more seriously. So I think Russia's going to have a harder and harder time intimidating its neighborhood. And, the Ukrainians have proved that they will fight tenaciously. So Putin and the Russians have every incentive right now to take an off-ramp. And we've seen, with the Prigozhin episode of a year or so ago, where, basically a Russian warlord, an independent contractor, decided, hey, I don't like the way Putin's treating my people. I'm going to go, the Wagner group. I don't like the way he's treating my people. Therefore, we're going to go and we're going to have perhaps a little coup against Putin. Well, that went a lot farther into Russia than Putin had expected. So the Russians, they are not, infinitely powerful. They're not going to be in Paris, if we don't stop them in Ukraine, and they're not even going to be in Kiev, for that matter, if they are, if there is a deal struck for peace. The Russians have pretty much gone as far as they can get, and this is the time to arrest their progress and to stop the killing.
What, if anything, most concerns you, either about that State of the Union, so-called, or about anything Trump has done thus far? Is there anything that bothers you or that you wish he hadn't done?
Well, I have to say, even though I'm not allergic to the idea that the Panama Canal should be under American control, my gut instinct is that we don't need it. That in fact, as long as it's secure, having that territory be Panama's makes more sense. But Pat Buchanan was in favor of keeping the Panama Canal back during the Jimmy Carter years. Ronald Reagan was in favor of keeping it. Interestingly enough, Bill Buckley and George Will were their opponents in a famous debate, saying that no, America should give back the Panama Canal. Even though all of that is, something I don't feel extremely intensely about, I did worry a little bit about the way Trump was phrasing the Panama situation in the address tonight. So he said, the Panama Canal simply is ours. We are going to take it. Then, when he talked about Greenland, he did so in a somewhat more, certainly an explicitly more, diplomatic manner. He said, it's up to Greenland to choose what its future is going to be. And if they want to be Americans, we would welcome them in. He then made a joke, which, I do take as a humorous thing and not as a worrying thing, saying, well, one way or another, it's going to be ours. So I think that is Trump's humor. That's not something that's, a veiled threat. Nevertheless, there is, I think there is a limit to how much, Panama will give. And similarly, with Canada, I'm all for making a mockery out of Justin Trudeau. And, I think that there are lots of issues with Canada in terms of fisheries, in terms of steel production, in terms of, fentanyl and other things. Fentanyl, even though it's not primarily a Canadian problem, it is something that is an issue with Canada. There are any number of things that we could be resolving. Some degree of tariffs and tough negotiating are in order, but simply, trying to put tariffs on Canada until they become the 51st state, that I think is not going to work and shouldn't even be tried. So now I don't know that that's what Trump's actually trying to do here, but I do worry that, if some of these more flamboyant statements are taken literally, and if they're meant literally, then that would be, creating a mess that we don't need.
The fentanyl thing is hard to credit with regard to Canada because it just doesn't seem like that big of an issue to justify this. I guess he's assuming that Canada has to buckle because it is such a small economy compared to ours, and so this isn't going to go on very long.
Yeah, so I have not closely followed the issue of Canada and fentanyl, and obviously it's much more of a Mexican issue. But I was surprised because I commissioned a Canadian to write for the Modern Age website, modernAgeJournal.com. And even though he's a patriotic Canadian, he's appalled by some of the things that Trump is doing towards his country. He actually said that, no, the fentanyl thing is kind of a real issue, and Canada's got a real problem there. So, even though I've seen a lot of just kind of dismissive remarks from pundit class people about that issue, I'm not inclined to dismiss it myself, since, I've heard a Canadian that I think is respectable actually say that that's, it's not an illegitimate issue. Trump, so, I've written a piece for the Spectator World magazine, which will come out, in the next month or so. It's in the issue that's at the printers right now. I think Trump does look at the world through the eyes of a real estate magnate. And he views the world as being landlords, being tenants, and squatters. So when he talked about, countries that might be called, he used a very indelicate phrase to say what kind of, hole he thought these countries were in. But those are countries that he thinks, they don't have good land management. They don't have a good landlord. It's just like, having squatters take over your building. That's what I think he thinks of those countries as being. Then there are a lot of other countries, and this includes Canada. It includes most of the European countries, that Donald Trump thinks, here you have tenants who just don't understand that the United States is their landlord, that we are economically and militarily, responsible for what happens in their countries. And therefore, they need to pay their rent, first of all, especially their NATO dues. But they also economically need to be completely cooperative with whatever the United States wants. So he has a landlord's mentality towards, Canada and towards Europe. And he thinks they're bad tenants. He thinks these are tenants who are constantly, doing damage to the apartment and, requiring American money, the landlord's money to come in and fix the plumbing and fix all these other problems. Meanwhile, they're not paying their rent. I think that's exactly the way Trump kind of looks at things fundamentally.
Getting back to that matter of Zelensky at the White House, J.D. Vance has taken some abuse from, people I didn't expect to compliment him, arguing that he mishandled that situation. He's been vice president now only a month and a half, but my impression of him overall is about as it was before, but maybe even a little bit better, in that I feel like, if you corner Donald Trump, he very often has read the articles. He will oftentimes come down on the right side. But if you want a systematic defense of that side, you can get that from J.D. Vance. Like he'll go 2, 3, 4, 5 layers deep with you on issue after issue, and he does that without losing his cool. I think that makes him a formidable politician.
I agree. I had very high expectations for Vice President Vance, and he has so far exceeded them. Typically a vice president is almost a passive figure, and when they're not a passive figure, they're a figure in the background, like Dick Cheney, kind of having influence behind the scenes. J.D. Vance has been, as outspoken, if not even perhaps more outspoken than President Trump himself, and he has been, a major public face of the administration. And precisely as you say, he is someone who understands the policies and the philosophy behind what Trump is doing, and is prepared to defend them, in any circumstance. He's going to defend them in the mainstream media, which he's done very effectively, and he's going to defend them if, someone like President Zelensky is there, making a mockery of, the Oval Office and President Trump's hospitality. And by the way, I thought that worked out very nicely because, if you're a host and you have a rude guest, you still want to be a host, and you still want to be, as tolerant, as forgiving as possible. And, if someone is going to correct your rude guest for his rudeness, ideally it should be someone else. And I think that was, that J.D. Vance was exactly right to step in when he did, and to challenge, some of these, remarks that Zelensky was constantly trying to insert into the discussion. And you'll notice that, and Trump, at first was, he was willing to let Vance and Zelensky have their discussion. And he was not, Trump himself was not getting directly involved in that until Zelensky started, telling Trump how Trump and America were going to feel about things that were going to happen with Russia. And, President Trump quite rightly then, told Zelensky what his place was. Zelensky has no place telling Americans what they're going to feel or what they should feel. He has no place, threatening America or telling America that, that we are in danger somehow if we don't give Zelensky exactly what he wants. President Trump's outrage was triggered by Zelensky, saying that he knew better than Americans do what America is going to feel and what America is going to experience based on the negotiations with Russia.
I can't stand these speeches because they're just the worst. I mean, whether it's a Republican or a Democrat, they tend to be messianic. They tend to involve ludicrous promises. They tend to be a whole lot of platitudes, slogans, patting Americans on the back, self-congratulation, and devoid of substance. Just it's in that sort of context that a Joe Biden would promise us that he was going to cure cancer, and people would actually applaud for that, like that was plausible. That Joe Biden might actually cure cancer. So this is why I more or less ignore these. What do you think about the Trump speech in relation to what I just said, which I'm sure you realize describes? I remember being in college, and which was a long time ago, and watching George H.W. Bush give one of these addresses. And it was exactly that. Even a Republican who's supposed to have a modest view of what is possible with government. I mean, you would think every problem was going to be solved in the next several years. How would you compare that not particularly attractive model of these speeches to the actual speech Trump just gave?
Well, you've got a great point. You've actually clarified something that had been on my mind. So, these speeches often are laundry lists, and you could say that the Trump speech was a laundry list. It had a lot of specific policies. But you're exactly right that traditionally these kinds of speeches, whether they are the State of the Union or something that's, a first term, not quite State of the Union because you haven't had a year in office yet speech like the one tonight, they often will use platitudes and very vague, utopian goals as a substitute for actually talking about controversial goals like, controlling the border and cracking down on crime and ending their ludicrous, DEI kind of projects and whatnot. So the utopian promises are an evasion. They're a way of avoiding talking about things that actually could be done, could be achieved, and should be done, but that are just controversial, and that politicians, once they get elected, they feel like, hey, why should I make life difficult for myself by engaging with controversial policies? I should just, continue with the same inertia as my predecessor, even if that person was from a different party, and just go along to get along. And Trump isn't doing that. Trump came into office basically planning to turn Washington upside down, and he's been doing that, for his first six weeks in office. So I thought the speech very effectively, avoided most of those platitudes and instead talked about concrete things that are, they're all conflicts. They're all things that, are going to be tough with Congress. They're going to be tough with the Democrats. And yet the Trump administration is confronting them head on. This is the first administration I can remember in my lifetime. I'm almost 50 years old now. And yet I can't think of another administration that has confronted things head on like this, and that has not, shirked from battle and shirked, controversy, but instead has embraced it and has gone, sort of full throttle, as Trump is doing on every front too, not just, picking one or two battles to fight, but really fighting every single battle. So that's remarkable. And I thought the speech conveyed that very effectively. I will say that the end of the speech, the peroration, did have a little bit of that sort of fancifulness that you got from traditional kinds of State of the Union speeches. So we started having these kind of rhapsodies about glass and steel skyscrapers. It was kind of Ayn Randish in a way. And, you had this, golden age of America and whatnot, which is, you expect some degree of platitude, even in a speech like this. So I did think, there's a bit of techno-utopianism, which sounded, I wrote in my notes to myself, it sounded a bit more like Elon Musk than Donald Trump, perhaps, and certainly more like, Musk than a traditional conservative or even traditional Republican, leader. Nevertheless, I thought this idea of ending on an optimistic note was the right thing to do. I'm much more of a curmudgeonly conservative who wants to throw the television out of the attic garret or whatever, as Russell Kirk famously did. So, I'm not moved by that techno-optimist kind of stuff, even though, it's nice to have, an iPhone or other kinds of convenient gadgets. But I think a lot of Americans clearly are. And obviously, Elon Musk represents a bit of that spirit, within government. And he's being helpful right now with Doge in trimming down this horrible, anti-democratic, anti-republican bureaucracy that we have. So, no, I give the speech high marks. And, what I really give it highest marks for is that it was confrontational. It talked about real things that can be achieved, and it used human stories in order to illustrate why those objectives should be achieved.
Oh, do you have anything interesting coming out in Modern Age?
We do. We have a very interesting essay by Roger Kimball from the New Criterion talking about the nature of kitsch. So that's, a very culturally, informative and rather rich and deep article. So it's wonderful. We have one of the things, by the way, I'm very proud of that we have coming out very soon, not in Modern Age precisely, but with the publishing division at ISI that I run, is a new book by the historian Walter McDougall called The Gems of American History. And some very persuasive blurbs are on the back of that book. And someone whose recommendations can always be trusted has in fact endorsed this book. So it's a great book that we've been responsible for editing and publishing. But I know it's even better because it has the Tom Woods seal of approval. Okay,
yes. I was going to say, if you didn't make clear that I'm the person you're talking about, I will do that. Okay, that's very good to know, and I'm happy about those things. ModernAgeJournal.com is where to go to check out Modern Age. It's been around since the late 50s. It is the venerable intellectual journal of the right. It is in very good hands with Dan McCarthy as editor, so I do urge you to check that out. ModernAgeJournal.com. Thank you very much, Dan, as always.
Thanks, Tom.
And thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Make yourself and those you love less vulnerable to the regime, both mentally and physically. Get more forbidden information at tomsfreebooks.com and be sure to subscribe to the show wherever you listen. See you next time.
Like the sound of The Tom Woods Show? My audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.